Okay, a couple of themes we're going to talk about with Nigeria that we've got right here on the board. Issues that are going to come up over and over again in this chapter. First, military versus democracy. Since Nigeria became independent of Britain in 1960, they've tried repeatedly to establish a democracy, and 3 times the military has come in, taken over, and made it into a military state. So they keep bouncing back and forth between military and democracy. Now, they've been a democracy now since the 1990s, so it's taken hold for 20, 25 years now. So it's leaning more towards democracy, but there is always this sort of underlying threat that the military may come back in if things get really bad and take over the country again. It's the most populous country in Africa. It is also the biggest economy in Africa. A lot of people in the West don't know a lot about Nigeria, but it's a huge country population-wise, big economy. By 2050, there will be more Nigerians than Americans, and I think a lot of people in the West don't realize how important it is in that region of the world. Muslim versus Christian. Most of the Muslims live in the north for reasons that we'll get into. Most of the Christians live in the south, and there's a lot of tension between them. Resources versus poverty. Nigeria has a ton of oil, but they haven't been able to take that resource and other natural resources that they have and make the majority of the people rich. There is a growing middle class in Nigeria, but there are also still a lot of really, really poor people there too. So how can they take the opportunity for wealth that they have with the oil and benefit all of the people? And then lastly, is Nigeria a nation? Nigeria's got 250 ethnic groups in it. Many of them speak different languages, different cultures. And if you ask a lot of people, they won't say I'm a Nigerian, they'll say I'm an Igbo or a Yoruba or whatever their ethnic group happens to be. So Nigeria is clearly a state. It's got population, borders, government, all of those things that we talked about. But whether or not as a nation is really kind of an open question. Do people really believe in Nigeria that they belong together? Or is it a random collection of people that the British just sort of randomly drew a border around and said, okay, you're together now? So we're going to look at those questions. We're going to talk now about history. And we're going to divide that into 3 different eras: the pre-colonial period, which is up until about the 1800s, the colonial period, when they're a colony of Britain, which is from the 1800s until 1960, so really about 100 years. And then the independence period, Nigeria became an independent country in 1960, so we'll divide it up into those 3. Pre-colonial. And in the pre-colonial era, the north and the south of Nigeria developed very differently. In the north, most of their trading network is with the Middle East. There's one particularly large kingdom in Mali that's incredibly powerful and wealthy, and the leader is one of the wealthiest people in the world. And the trade that they do is connected with the Middle East. If you think about Africa, that's a map of Nigeria is here. This is the Middle East over here. When the Arabs sort of moved west, it came like this. And so it would have gone into like the northern part of Nigeria. That's where the trade was. That's where Islam came from. So the northerners still today are mostly Islamic, mostly Muslim because of that. The major ethnic group there is called Hausa Fulani. They were 2 separate groups. They basically intermarried. That's the major group there now. And they had a lot of very large kingdoms, like the one that's now called the Malian Kingdom. That sort of was part of Nigeria in the north. So you have these big, strong rulers who are like the authoritarian, kings or emirs or whatever you want to call them. in the northern part of the country, and their orientation to the world was toward the Middle East, south. You didn't have these big kingdoms in the south. You had a lot of sort of smaller villages that sort of ruled themselves, and because of that, the leaders had to be more responsive to the people. It was a smaller group. The leaders knew the people they were ruling over. So there's a lot more back and forth, I guess you could say, between the leaders and between the people. Eventually, they are going to start to be affected heavily by the slave trade. And literally millions of people are taken out of this part of Africa to the west to be slaves. The northern part was affected by that less, just because it was harder for Westerners to get to access that part of the country. So the slave trade has a huge effect here in the south, and most of their orientation is towards not the Middle East, but Europe. Not only the slave trade, but eventually colonization by the British and other kinds of trade. And that makes sense. If this is Europe up here, they are going to reach Nigeria by boat. This little boat I just drew. And so the southern part is going to have the contact with Europe, not the Middle East, which explains why they're going to end up being more Christian than Muslim. So the north and the south in the pre-colonial period developed very, very differently. So in the south you've got trade, slave trade, but also trading goods with Europe. In the north is mostly trade with the Middle East. Then you start talking about the colonial period, which is mostly the mid-1800s, where Britain starts to have a big influence. And then in 1885, and the Europeans are starting to fight each other in Africa to colonize the different countries and to use the resources. And so the Europeans say, you know what, let's quit fighting, let's just sit down and divide up the map. And so they have this Berlin Conference in 1885, where Britain says, I'll take this, France says, I'll take that, Germany takes this. The Africans didn't get any say in the matter, but Britain ends up getting Nigeria. And basically they just drew some borders and said, okay, we're gonna call this place Nigeria. It wasn't sort of a natural fit of people and land that ought to be together. They just drew some borders and set it up and said, okay, Nigeria. And they called it that because it was right next to another French colony called Niger, N-I-G-E-R. Britain didn't know what to call this, so they just said, we'll call it Nigeria. And that's how it got a name. It doesn't mean anything more than that. So the British take over in the north. It's still very difficult for the British to access the north. So they rule sort of indirectly through whoever the local leaders are. They communicate with the local leaders, here's what we want, but basically the leaders are in charge day to day. And because of that, they're going to retain Islam. In the south, it's easier for the British to be there, for British people to be there, for Britain to have a better influence. So the British presence is going to be bigger. And because that's where they are, they're going to build schools, they're going to build roads and hospitals and do all the things that the British Empire does, much more in the south than in the north. And you can see that today there's still more schools and hospitals and better infrastructure in the south than there is in the north. And some of that anyway goes back to what the British did. Because the British are there, this area is going to basically adopt Christianity. But also what the British did, it's one of the tactics that they used often, is they divided the people against each other. And so this group against that group, because if the groups were fighting each other, they weren't fighting the British. If they favored one group a little more than the other, that would create some animosity, and it would allow the British to rule over everybody a little bit better. So you've got this big split in colonial times between the South and the north. And we're going to look at a couple of maps about that. Okay, so the first one is right here. Hopefully you can see it. It's ethnic diversity, major ethnic groups. There's 250 of them. The Hausa Fulani, or this big blue-green group right here, that's 29% of the country, mostly Muslim. The Yoruba down in the southwest, red right here, they're mostly Christian. The green, the third biggest group is the Igbo, 18%. They're right here, and then all sorts of other groups there as well. Oil. This is where all the oil is, down in the south. And you can see that's not only this is where the pipelines are, and because of that, a lot of Nigeria's wealth is generated in the south, and maybe because of that, what we're going to see is that the south tends to be wealthier than the north. Right here, this says poverty. States showing percent living in absolute poverty. The darkest one is 80% plus, so up here in the north you have some states where 80% plus of the people are living in absolute poverty, and then the lighter, when you get down to the bottom, you'll see that the poverty gets less and you have fewer people living in poverty. Maybe that's because of the oil, maybe that's because of the British building the infrastructure and that kind of thing, who could say. Health, same thing. This is measured by percentage of children aged 12 to 23 months who have received all their vaccinations. Up top, between 0 and 10%, single digits. Down at the bottom, well up into the 60%. So by that measure, the South is a lot healthier. Literacy, the darker are the more literate places. So some of the states up top, less than 20%. Some of the states in the South, particularly the Southwest, up over 70%. So there is still today a big, and this also shows Boko Haram attacks. In the country, Boko Haram is a Muslim terrorist group, and they're mostly going to be in the north as well. So in a lot of ways, the South and the North are very, very different from each other. And why that is, who could say a lot of different theories, whether that had anything to do with the British or not, or the oil, or whatever it is. But they've developed very differently from each other. So the British are there for about 100 years. Eventually, as we talked about when we studied Britain after World War II, Britain's going to start financially and for other reasons letting their empire go, and Nigeria is going to achieve independence in 1960. And what they're going to do is they're going to set up a government that looks a lot like Britain's, with a parliament, no president, and it lasts for 6 years before there is a military coup. And so this first attempt at a government is called the First Republic. The military comes in and says, this isn't working, we're going to take over and bring back some order and get things under control. From 67 to 70, they have something called the Biafran Civil War. Biafra is a place in southeast Nigeria. They want to break away and be their own country. Nigeria doesn't want to let them go. So a pretty brutal civil war there for about 3 years before Nigeria comes out on top in that. 1979, the military gives the country back to the civilians. They set up a democracy again. This time it's going to be a presidential system where one person is in charge. And that's going to last for 4 years until 1983, when there is a military coup. And by the way, the person who The general who gave the country democracy, who gave up power for democracy in 1979, is named General Obasanjo, and his name is going to come up again. 1983, there is a military coup led by General Muhammadu Buhari, B-U-H-A-R-I, and his name is going to come up again too. So Buhari is the military leader as of 1983. He's the one who did the coup. 1993. In 1993, there's a plan to try again with the democracy. Before it happens, right when it's about to happen, there's another military coup by a man named General Abacha, who's a bad man. Abacha's the worst of the worst as far as corruption, killing his own citizens, everything you can imagine. He was the worst. So this period, 79 to 83, is called the Second Republic. This republic that never happened is called the Third Republic. And so Nigeria goes back to a military dictatorship in the 90s. 1999, it goes back to being a democracy. And so from 1999 to today, it's called the Fourth Republic. So they've been able to hold on to a republic for about 20 years now. The first president is the guy who was the former military leader named President Obasanjo. He gets elected in 1999, and he serves as president from 1999 until 2007. And so they have a number of elections in a row. 2015, they elect a man named Muhammadu Buhari, who is the same guy who used to be the general in charge of the country, who led the 1983 military coup. And Buhari is still the president today. He got reelected last year. So what you can see is that even they've tried to establish a democracy. There's been a number of military coups. Even in the Fourth Republic, most of the leaders who have been elected are generals or former military leaders. So there's a really close connection in Nigeria between military and politics.